As we approach week 5 of the college football season, there are less than 25 undefeated teams remaining. While some have not been a shock, others have seemingly came out of nowhere. Not surprisingly, a lot of teams have been criticized and some have been hyped up. And in today's video, I want to go through all the Power 5 schools plus the big Group of 5 schools, and we are going to determine if they are a contender or a pretender. I think this video will do pretty well, but if you want to support it, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you are new here, and turn on post notifications. And now let's tell the truth about every single undefeated team left in college football. We're first going to start out with the Group of 5 teams and the independents, as the first team we're going to follow is SMU. So far, they are 4-0, and while they are not ranked, I think they should be. They won their first 3 games, and in that third matchup against Louisiana Tech, they actually had a Hail Mary. Tanner Mordecai has been one of the biggest surprises in all of college football, and he led them to a road win against TCU this past weekend. The hardest game left on the schedule is a road game against Memphis and one against Cincinnati, and while they're definitely not going to make the playoff, I think this team has the potential to make it pretty far and get to a big-time bowl game. The other team out of the American is the Cincinnati Bearcats, led by Desmond Ridder and up-and-coming head coach Luke Fickell. So far, the Bearcats have gotten off to a great start. While they did struggle in the first half against Murray State, they came out and blew them out in the second half. They then went on the road and beat Indiana in a thrilling game, and now they have the game that will determine the entire season, and that is a road matchup with Notre Dame. Besides that, there's nothing on the schedule except maybe the SMU game that I'm worried about, and with the kind of wins they have, I believe Cincinnati is a contender for the college football playoff. Notre Dame has been one of the weirdest teams in college football this year, as they barely escaped both Florida State and Toledo, had some difficulties against Purdue, and then blew out Wisconsin. The first 4 games were all over the place, and the schedule is somewhat difficult. Games against Cincinnati, USC, North Carolina, and Virginia come to mind, but pretty much every team on the schedule could potentially give them fits. I believe Notre Dame is a contender, and if they win 11 or 12 games in the schedule, I think they can make the playoff. One of the surprises of the 2021 college football season has been BYU. Despite losing Zach Wilson, the Cougars have beaten 4 solid teams to start out the year. They beat Arizona, number 21 Utah, and number 19 Arizona State. These were all great games, and there's still a lot of fun games left on the schedule as they play Baylor, Washington State, Virginia, and USC. If they can win all these games, I honestly could see them as a playoff contender, and they are not a pretender. Heading over to the ACC, the first team we need to talk about is Wake Forest. So far, they've beaten Old Dominion, Norfolk State, Florida State, and Virginia, and while none of those teams pop off the page, they were all decent wins. The schedule really isn't that difficult until their last 4 games, as they'll go on the road to North Carolina, NC State, Clemson, and Boston College. I could see them starting the season 8-0, but as of right now, I think they are a pretender instead of a contender. The only other team out of the ACC that is undefeated is Boston College. So far, they really haven't played anyone of notice until this past weekend when they played against Missouri. They lost their starting quarterback Phil Dracovic to an injury, which in my opinion is detrimental to their actual long-term chances, but Dennis Grosel did enough for them to beat the Tigers, and we're going to find out a lot more about them as they play against Clemson and NC State in the next 2 weeks, and I think they are a pretender. I'll be the first to admit that I was not a believer in Dave Aranda or this Baylor program. I had no clue what they had at the running back, wide receiver, or quarterback spot, but they have proven me wrong so far. They beat Texas State, Texas Southern, and Kansas, which wasn't very impressive, but then this past weekend they got a huge win. They beat number 14 Iowa State at home, and despite letting up a game-tying touchdown, they did not let the Cyclones get the 2-point conversion, and they're now 4-0. They have a very difficult schedule ahead, as they'll play against Oklahoma State, West Virginia, BYU, Texas, TCU, Oklahoma, and Kansas State in the coming weeks, and right now I think they're a pretender. Expectations were sky high for Spencer Rattler and the Oklahoma Sooners this year, and so far they have kind of disappointed. Tulane played them really tough in week 1, but we have since found out that the Green Wave are not that good. Oklahoma did kill Western Carolina, but they barely beat Nebraska and survived against West Virginia this past weekend, and things will continue to get difficult for them, and they have a very difficult back half of the schedule. It's hard to say they aren't a contender because of the amount of talent and Spencer Rattler, but at this point, based on the record, they have been a pretender. Some thought Mike Gundy was losing his touch at Oklahoma State, but so far this year they've proved people wrong. So far, they have lived on the edge. They barely beat Missouri State, barely beat Tulsa, and barely beat Boise State on the road, but they were 3-0, and this past weekend, they beat number 25 Kansas State at home by 2 scores. While they're inevitably going to lose a game soon, good for Oklahoma State for being 4-0, but they are a pretender. The Big Ten currently has 5 undefeated teams, and that does not include Ohio State. The first team we're going to talk about is Michigan State. They went on the road and beat Northwestern in their first game, and that was impressive. They then killed Youngstown State at home before they went on the road and dominated Miami. This past weekend they struggled a little bit, but they came back and beat Nebraska, and they are now 4-0. Peyton Thorne is a young star quarterback, Kenneth Walker is a Heisman contender, and Jaden Reed is one of the best wide receivers in the country. Honestly, I think Michigan State is actually a contender, and if they can beat 2 out of the 3 of Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, they could actually find themselves in the Big Ten Championship or the College Football Playoff, and I think they are a contender. Surprisingly, Mike Locksley has his Maryland Terrapins at 4-0, and we're going to find out this Friday if they're actually legit. They beat West Virginia in their first game, and also went on the road and beat Illinois. The other 2 games were popcorn games, but we're quickly going to find out if this team is legit or not, as their next games include Iowa, Ohio State, Indiana, Penn State, Michigan State, and Michigan. While I'm really happy for the team, I think they are pretenders. Usually Michigan is overrated going into the year, but this time the Wolverines did not start out ranked, and maybe that was good for them. They killed Western Michigan in their first game, beat Washington on a primetime stage, killed Northern Illinois, and survived against Rutgers this past weekend. This year the Wolverines have been good, fueled by their running back Blake Corum. Cade McNamara's looked solid, and overall the team is playing really well. We'll find out a little bit more this weekend as they go on the road to Wisconsin, but they get Ohio State at home and have to go on the road for Penn State and Michigan State, so we'll see how they do, but right now, I think they are a contender. Penn State has proved that they are a great team so far, as they've beaten 2 really solid opponents. In week 1, they beat Wisconsin, and despite some setbacks, they won that game and then killed Ball State at home in week 2. Then in a national stage against an SEC school in the whiteout, they survived a game against Auburn, and this past weekend they beat Villanova. They play Indiana at home this upcoming weekend, and then go on the road to Iowa for what could be the biggest game in the Big Ten this year. Speaking of Iowa, they have been very impressive to start the year. They opened up and killed number 17 Indiana at home in week 1, and then went on the road and beat their arch rival number 9 Iowa State. They have since played against Kent State and survived a scare against Colorado State, but Iowa has a great defense and this team is well coached, so I think they're going to be really good this year. Outside of games against Penn State and Wisconsin, they have a pretty favorable schedule, and I legitimately think that Iowa could find themselves undefeated going into the Big Ten championship game, and maybe they could make the playoff, so I do believe they are a contender. UCLA dropped the ball, so Oregon is the only undefeated team left in the Pac-12. They beat a really good Fresno State team in week 1, and then went on the road and pulled a shocker against Ohio State in week 2. Since then, they beat Stony Brook and survived against Arizona, but this team is definitely legit. They have a great defense. I like Anthony Brown at quarterback. They have a good duo of running backs, and overall, this team is just fundamentally sound, and I think they are a contender. Outside of their road game against UCLA, there's not really a game on the schedule I think that'll give them much of a challenge, and the Ducks are a legit playoff contender. Before we get to the SEC, we're going to quickly address Coastal Carolina. At this point, they are 4-0 with wins over the Citadel, Kansas, on the road against Buffalo, and at home against UMass. None of those schools are any good this year, and honestly, there is not a whole lot going on in their schedule. Outside of a road game against Appalachian State, there is no team that in my eyes is even close to a top 25 opponent, and even if they were to win all their games in blowout fashion, there's no possible way they get into the College Football Playoff. So while I think they're good, they are a pretender in terms of that. There are currently 5 teams in the SEC who are undefeated, and we're first going to start out with the Georgia Bulldogs. They have looked spectacular, and they were my pick to win the national championship going into this year. JT Daniels hasn't had to play a whole lot as they've had a couple blowout games, and outside of their week 1 game against Clemson, no one's given them a test. Their defense is dominant, they have a good group of running backs, a young star in Brock Bowers, and some great quarterback options, and I think Georgia's good enough to go undefeated and get to the College Football Playoff, so they are definitely a contender. Kentucky is trying to have a 2018 season all over again, as they started out this year with a win over Louisiana Monroe, and have also beaten Chattanooga. They won a conference game against Missouri in week 2, and just barely survived on the road against South Carolina this past weekend. While Will Levis is an upgraded quarterback, the defense is great, and Chris Rodriguez is an NFL running back, I'm a little bit concerned about this team, as they've barely survived against the lower tier SEC opponents, so in my opinion, there's no reason why they can beat Florida, LSU, or Georgia, and right now I have them as a pretender, even though I'm really happy for them. Surprise, surprise, the Alabama Crimson Tide are 4-0 in 2021, and no one could have expected that. After a week 1 win against Miami, the Tide have impressed. They killed Mercer in Southern Miss and won a really tough road game against Florida. While the Gators did expose some of their flaws, it was great of them to win that game, and Alabama is definitely looking good. They have some difficult games though. They have to play number 12 Ole Miss, on the road against Texas A&M, home against LSU, home against Arkansas, and on the road against number 22 Auburn. So there's a lot of good games left on the schedule, but they are 100% a contender, and who in their right mind wouldn't have Bama going to the playoff at this point? The Arkansas Razorbacks have been the biggest surprise of the 2021 college football season, as they have broken out of nowhere under second-year head coach Sam Pittman. Led by KJ Jefferson, a dominant running game, and one of the best receivers in the country in Treylon Burks, the Razorbacks have gotten off to a 4-0 start with a dominating win over number 15 Texas in a game that was not as close as the score indicates against number 7 Texas A&M. So far, everyone loves the Hogs, and they are America's team, but we're going to find out really quickly what they're made of. In their next 3 games, they play on the road against Georgia and Ole Miss, and then have a home game against number 22 Auburn. If they can win 2 of those games, I think they are a contender, and with how they're playing, it is hard to argue they are not a contender. Now we get to our last undefeated team of this video, and that is the Ole Miss Rebels. In their first 3 games, they've beaten up on Louisville, Austin Peay, and Tulane, and while Matt Corral has put up Heisman-like numbers, I'm really not quite sure to make of this team. I don't think Louisville's that great, and the 2 other teams they played are nothing special. We'll find out real quickly in their next 2 games as they play on the road against Alabama and then at home against number 8 Arkansas. Many people say this is the battle for the Heisman Trophy between Matt Corral and Bryce Young. And with Corral at the helm and Lane Kiffin, I think Ole Miss is a contender, but they have to prove it. So yeah, today we went through pretty much all the undefeated schools and talked about if they are a contender or pretender. Let me know your thoughts on today's video. Who is a pretender and who's a contender in your eyes? What are some one-loss teams that you think are contenders? And let me know another topic I should take a look at next. Before you go, be sure to hit that like button if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.